So the final section of the course in terms of dedicated content is that of remuneration, specifically executive remuneration. But before we get to executive remuneration, I think it's such a topical issue at the moment in the press and just generally, and it probably always will be, how we remunerate our leaders. It's worth thinking about what's behind a lot of the discussions in executive remuneration, and that's this idea of what is a fair pay for someone. Okay, so that's why the topic we've got is remunerating justly. The core content from a governance perspective is thinking about how you set executive remuneration, but I think we can set that in a kind of broader view of why people have problems with how much people are paid. And to do that, maybe we can go back to a little bit of ethics and philosophy. So the first thing we want to have a look at is this idea of distributive justice. A core challenge for us when we're having discussions about what is a fair rate of pay is, what does fairness actually mean? What is just? And the philosophers would tend to use the word just and justice rather than fairness. Fairness has a connotation to them. So you can think about this when you have any kind of reward or any kind of good that people want. How do you distribute that between multiple people? So in the firm, we've made some profit, and then who's going to get that profit? How much of that profit or how much of the money, the turnover that comes in, should go to management? So it's a distribution problem. One way of thinking about it is the way we distribute anything and the rewards, in inverted commas, in different situations. So for instance, if you've got kids, I've got a couple of kids and you've got a cake, how do you distribute the cake? And so the classic answer to that is, one kid cut the cake in half and the other kid chews it. And that avoids a lot of fights. But the basic idea there is everyone should get the same. Right? So the idea of fairness in that situation is about an equality of outcome. Okay, so that sounds pretty good, but does it work all the time? So let's think about what grades should we distribute in this subject in 473. Well, surely under that principle, I should give everyone exactly the same grade. Right? That would be a fair outcome. Everyone gets the same thing. Yeah, that's kind of not the point of what we're doing here. So then you have a different outcome. Maybe the way you should distribute it is based upon how much effort people put in, right? So maybe that's how I should grade, based on effort and the amount of hours that people put into the subject. Wouldn't that be fairer? Well, specifically universities and QUT, well, not all universities, but QUT in particular has a policy that says you can't do that. Right? You can't give grades for attendance, for instance. So you're not allowed to reward effort. Right? So that, under some people's view, isn't a fair way of actually indicating, because the point of the grading system is to discriminate, hopefully to discriminate between the performance and the ability to do a task that's asked of them. And so really the idea behind, say, a QUT system is that we treat people and cases the same way. It's trying to avoid bias. And so it doesn't matter how long you take to do an assignment, it's that it's graded against the same criteria with a lack of bias, so that in that way it becomes fair. And that's the position taken throughout the university. So what you can see is a conflict. Different situations call for different definitions of fairness because you're trying to do different things. And that people often have different views on what fairness and equality is. And I think that's one of the huge areas, which I don't want to unpack too much, but I think a lot of the disagreement between people around any kind of diversity measure, it becomes this issue of, are you talking about equality of outcome, or are you talking about equality of the opportunity to progress within the system? Because they're not necessarily the same thing. So I think part of the problem then, if we transfer it to a governance setting, is this idea that different segments, different people in society, not even segments, different people in society have a different view about how much executives should get paid. So some people think, no one is worth, being paid a certain amount of money, right? That's kind of like the cake example, right? You shouldn't get more than your fair share, right? Doesn't matter how hard you worked, or it doesn't matter how good you are. It just, the problem is there's something unfair about getting paid too much, right? That's splitting the cake evenly between two people. Then there are other people who say, well, look, really, they don't work hard, right? I mean, really, you can only do 60 hours, 70 hours work anyway, so they're not working any harder than anyone else. The effort isn't there, so they don't deserve higher pay. Counterpoint, right? A lot of people will make the argument that CEOs and senior executives essentially sacrifice their lives for these positions. They give up family, they give all that. So they are working much harder than everyone, and therefore they deserve the pay. A different argument comes about the ability that the senior executive, the CEO in particular, is responsible for the outcome, and therefore they deserve it. Right? They deserve it because of the outputs that they have. And whenever you hear a debate about linking CEO pay to performance, that's the kind of argument they're making, right? It's about, did you deliver the outcome, etc. That's the underlying logic. So there's lots of different views about what fairness looks like, and I think we're always going to be struggling with different people having different views of fairness. Just like in ethics, we would have different people having different views around deontological versus a teleological position. And in reality, if you're in a board position making these decisions, you have to be conscious of those different perspectives, right? There could be a good reason to set a pay at a certain level, as we'll go through, but you've got to remember that there will be a number of people in society and probably a very large segment who don't see it that way. And they don't see it that way because they don't see the problem the way you're confronted with the problem. And so even thinking about how you manage that is an important element of understanding justice and remuneration, right? To make sure that your remuneration packages not only have to be fair, I think a lot of time they have to be seen to be fair. And I think understanding your logic and why you're doing it the way you're doing it can be particularly important.